poor cowboy inherited a ranch, then learned it came with a widow who hated him. The horse's hooves made soft sounds in the dust, like whispers that nobody wanted to hear. Samuel pulled the reins and stopped at the edge of what the lawyer had called his inheritance. Before him stretched a ranch that looked tired. Tired buildings, tired fence posts, tired land that seemed to be holding its breath. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the letter again, though he knew every word by heart now. The paper was soft from handling, creased where his fingers had worried it during the long ride from town. Property of deceased Jeremiah Holt, it said. Next of kin, Samuel Holt, nephew. A man he had never met, never heard his father mention, now giving him something from the grave. The house sat low and square against the evening sky, built from wood that had turned gray under too many seasons. Smoke rose thin and straight from the chimney, which meant someone was inside. The lawyer had said the place was empty, said it had been sitting there waiting for him like a gift nobody wanted to give. Samuel's horse shifted under him, eager for water and rest. He patted the animal's neck and rode forward, watching the windows for movement. The front door stood closed, but he could feel eyes on him from somewhere in the shadows. When he reached the porch, he tied his horse to a post and stood for a moment, listening. The only sounds were the wind through dry grass and the distant lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the hills. He knocked on the door with knuckles that felt strange against the wood, like he was asking permission to enter his own life. The door opened, and Samuel found himself looking at a woman in black. She was not old, maybe 30 or so, with dark hair pulled back severe and eyes that held the kind of sadness that changes the shape of a person's face. Her dress was the deep black of mourning, worn but clean, and she held the door like it was the only thing keeping the world from falling down around her. "You must be Samuel," she said. Her voice was quiet, careful, like someone talking in church. "Yes, ma'am." He took off his hat and held it against his chest. "I got word about the property. About my uncle. Jeremiah was my husband." The words hung in the air between them like dust motes in afternoon light. Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach. The lawyer had said nothing about a wife, said nothing about anyone still living here, still calling this place home. "Ma'am, I think there might be some mistake." "No mistake." She stepped back from the door but did not invite him in. "Jeremiah left everything to you in his will. The land, the house, the cattle, everything." She paused, and her fingers tightened on the door frame. "Everything except me. I don't come with the property, Mr. Holt, though it seems nobody thought to tell me where else I should go." Samuel stood there with his hat in his hands, feeling like he had walked into someone else's dream by accident. The woman, his uncle's widow, looked at him with eyes that were not angry, exactly, but not welcoming either. She looked at him like he was a storm cloud on the horizon, inevitable and unwanted. "I'm Martha," she said finally. "Martha Holt. Though I suppose that name doesn't mean much now. Mrs. Holt, I didn't know. Nobody told me you were here. If there's been some kind of error." "There's no error." She looked past him toward his horse, his simple saddle, his worn clothes. "You look like him, you know, Jeremiah. Around the eyes. He used to wonder about his family, about a brother he lost touch with years ago. Guess he found a way to bring you home after all." Home. The word felt strange coming from her mouth, applied to him. Samuel had not had a home in longer than he cared to remember. Just horses and cattle drives and towns where nobody knew his name. The idea that this place might be home seemed as foreign as speaking Chinese. "Ma'am, if you need time to make arrangements, to find somewhere else, somewhere else." Martha's voice was flat as week-old coffee. 20 years I've lived on this land. 20 years I've known every fence post, every water hole, every place where the wind hits different. But you're right, Mr. Holt. I suppose I should make arrangements." She stepped back into the house, and Samuel thought she meant to close the door in his face. Instead, she left it open and disappeared into the shadows inside. He stood on the porch, uncertain whether to follow or wait or ride away, and pretend this whole thing had been someone else's mistake. The sun was getting low, painting everything the color of old copper. Samuel's horse snorted and pawed at the ground, reminding him that animals need food and water, regardless of human complications. He looked around the property, trying to see it as his own, but all he could think about was the woman inside and the way she had said somewhere else like the words tasted bitter. When Martha came back, she carried a bundle of cloth and a small wooden box. She did not look at Samuel when she spoke. "There's hay in the barn for your horse. Well, water is clean. I've made a pot of beans that'll last a few days." She paused at the edge of the porch. "I'll be gone by morning. Mrs. Holt, wait." But she was already walking away, toward a small shed behind the house. Samuel watched her go, her black dress moving like a shadow against the fading light. He felt the weight of the property deed in his pocket and wondered if some gifts were too heavy to carry. That night, Samuel made his bed in the barn. Not because Martha had asked him to, but because the house felt full of things that did not belong to him. Memories and morning routines and the ghost of a man he had never known but who had given him everything. The hay was soft enough, and his horse seemed grateful for the shelter and grain. Through the barn door he could see the house. One window glowed yellow with lamplight, and sometimes Martha's shadow moved across it. She was awake, sitting by what he guessed was the fireplace, keeping watch over something he could not name. Samuel lay in the hay and listened to the night sounds of his inherited land. Somewhere in the darkness, cattle moved and settled. An owl called from the direction of the creek. The wind made the barn door creak on its hinges like an old man getting up from a chair. He thought about the woman in the house and the way she had looked at him, not with hate exactly, but with the kind of tired resignation of someone who has had too many things taken away. Tomorrow she would be gone, and this place would be his in truth as well as on paper. The thought should have made him happy or at least satisfied. Instead, it sat in his chest like undigested food. In the morning, he would have to decide what kind of man inherits another man's life and what kind of man lets a widow disappear into the world with nothing but a cloth bundle and a wooden box. But tonight, with the hay soft beneath him and the strange weight of ownership settling over his shoulders, Samuel closed his eyes and listened to the sound of two strangers sharing the same patch of earth under the same stars, both keeping vigil over different kinds of loss. Martha did not leave in the morning. Samuel woke with the first gray light to find her still there, hanging wet clothes on the line behind the house like she had done it 1,000 times before. Her black dress moved in the early wind, and she worked with the careful precision of someone who had learned that routine could hold a broken world together. He watched her from the barn door while he saddled his horse, neither of them speaking across the distance of the yard. When she went inside, he rode out to see what his inheritance looked like in daylight. The cattle were scattered across brown hills, thin from a hard winter and the kind of neglect that comes when a man gets too sick to care for anything but staying alive. Samuel counted maybe 60 head where there should have been twice that many. The fences sagged in places, wire stretched loose or broken entirely. Posts leaned at angles that spoke of years without repair. It would take time to fix what was broken here. Time and work and money he did not have. But it was his now, for better or worse, and Samuel had never been the kind of man to walk away from hard things just because they were hard. He spent the morning mending fence, his hands moving with the steady rhythm of someone who had done such work in a dozen different places for men who paid him by the day. The sun climbed higher, and sweat made tracks through the dust on his face. When he looked back toward the house, he could see Martha in her garden, bent over rows of earth that looked as tired as everything else on this land. At noon, she brought him water. Samuel saw her coming across the field with a jar and a piece of cloth, walking careful in her good dress through ground that wanted to catch and tear at fabric. She set the jar on a fence post and stepped back, not meeting his eyes. "Thank you," he said, but she was already walking away. The water was cool and tasted of iron from the well. Samuel drank it slow, watching her return to her garden, and wondered what kind of pride it took to bring water to a man you wished was not there. That evening, he found a plate of food waiting on the porch step. Beans and cornbread and a piece of salt pork that must have come from the last of someone's winter stores. Martha was nowhere to be seen, but lamplight glowed from the kitchen window. Samuel took the plate to the barn and ate by the light of his own small fire. The food was simple but good, seasoned with the kind of care that came from hands that knew their way around making something from nothing. When he finished, he washed the plate at the pump and left it clean on the porch where she could find it. The next day brought the same careful dance. Samuel worked the land while Martha tended her stubborn garden and kept the house running like clockwork. They shared the water pump and the same stretches of shadow when the sun got too hot, but never words. She left food. He left the dishes clean. It was not conversation, but it was something. On the third day, Samuel found a cow caught in loose wire near the creek. The animal had struggled until the metal cut deep into her leg, and by the time he reached her, she was near crazy with pain and fear. Samuel worked slow and gentle, talking soft while he cut the wire away and cleaned the wound with creek water and strips of cloth from his own shirt. He did not know Martha was watching until he looked up and saw her standing 20 yards away, her hands folded in front of her dark dress. She did not come closer, but she did not leave either. Just stood there while Samuel wrapped the cow's leg and helped the animal back to her feet. "She'll be all right," he called across the distance. "Cut's not as deep as it looked." Martha nodded once and walked away, but something in her shoulders had changed. Some small measure of tension had gone out of them. That night there were 2 plates on the porch step. Samuel stared at them for a long moment, then knocked on the door. When Martha opened it, he held up the plates and raised his eyebrows in question. "Seemed foolish to eat the same food in different places," she said. Her voice was quiet, but not unfriendly. "If that's all right with you." They ate at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low between them. The silence was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people who had forgotten how to talk to strangers, trying to remember what words were for. Samuel cleaned his plate and set his fork down careful. "Mrs. Holt, I want you to know." "Martha," she said. "Just Martha. Martha." He tried the name out, found it fit his mouth better than the formal distance of Mrs. Holt. "I want you to know I never meant to put you out of your home. If there's a way to make this right, there's no making it right." She stood and began clearing dishes, her movements quick and efficient. "Jeremiah's gone. Has been for 3 months now. Took sick in February, and by April he was buried in the little cemetery past the creek." She paused with plates in her hands, looking out the dark window. "He wrote that will when he knew he was dying. Spent his last weeks worrying about what would happen to this place." Samuel watched her face in the lamplight, seeing grief there but also something else. Something that might have been relief. "He never talked much about family," Martha continued. "But near the end, he kept asking about his brother Thomas. Kept wondering if Thomas had children, if there was someone left who carried the Holt name." She looked at Samuel directly for the first time since that first day. "Guess he found you." "I never knew him," Samuel said. "My father never spoke of a brother. But I'm grateful." "Don't be grateful yet." Martha's voice was dry as dust. "This place has a way of taking more than it gives. Jeremiah learned that. I learned it too." She finished with the dishes and turned to go, then stopped at the doorway. "You did good with that cow today," she said without looking back. "Jeremiah always said you could tell a man's character by how he treats something that can't help itself." After she was gone, Samuel sat alone at the table and listened to the house settle around him. Somewhere above, floorboards creaked as Martha moved through rooms that held 20 years of her life. Outside, wind moved through dry grass and rattled windows that needed new putty. Tomorrow would bring more fence to mend, more cattle to tend, more of the slow work of bringing order to neglect. But tonight, for the first time since arriving, Samuel felt like maybe he was not entirely unwelcome on this land. In the kitchen window, his reflection looked back at him. A man trying to figure out how to inherit more than just property, how to find his place in a story that had already been half-written by other people's love and loss. The lamp burned low between dirty dishes and clean silverware, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across walls that had heard every kind of conversation, except the one that might bridge the careful distance between two people learning to share the same ground. The storm came from the west like an angry thought, building all afternoon until the sky turned the color of old bruises. Samuel was checking the barn roof when the first fat drops hit the dust, each one making a small dark circle in the dirt like tears on a dry face. By evening, rain was coming down in sheets that turned the world gray and made the windows weep. Wind howled around the corners of the house and rattled the shutters like something trying to get in. Samuel had moved his horse into the barn and made sure the chickens were safe, but there was nothing to do now but wait for the storm to blow itself out. Martha had insisted he come inside when the lightning started. Not with words, she never used more words than necessary, but by opening the front door and standing there with her arms crossed until he gathered his things and came up from the barn. The house felt small with both of them in it, like a box that had been built for one person's loneliness and was not sure how to hold two. "Coffee's on the stove," Martha said, then disappeared into the kitchen. Samuel hung his wet coat on a peg by the door and looked around the front room with the careful attention of someone finally allowed to see what had been hidden. The furniture was simple but well made. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace where a small fire crackled against the damp. Shelves held a few books, some dishes, a clock that ticked steady as a heartbeat. On the mantel sat a photograph of a man and woman on their wedding day, both young and serious in the way people got when they knew someone was going to capture their faces forever. The man in the photograph looked like Samuel around the eyes, just as Martha had said. But where Samuel was lean from years of drifting, this man, Jeremiah, had the solid build of someone who had found his place and meant to stay there. His hand rested on Martha's shoulder, and even in the stiff pose required by the camera, you could see something gentle in the way his fingers curved. "That was taken in town the day we married," Martha said from the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. 23 years ago this October." She handed him a cup and sat in the rocking chair, not looking at the photograph. Samuel took the other chair and tried to think of something to say that would not sound foolish or empty. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills like God moving furniture in the sky. "He looks like a good man," Samuel said finally. He was. Martha's voice was quiet, but not sad exactly. More like someone stating a simple fact. "Best man I ever knew. Patient as Job and twice as stubborn." The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. Rain drummed on the roof and windows with the kind of steady rhythm that made you forget there had ever been silence in the world. Samuel sipped his coffee and waited, sensing that Martha had more to say but needed time to find the words. "We tried for children," she said suddenly, still looking at the fire instead of at him. "Tried for 15 years. Had 3 that didn't make it past the first few months, and after that," she shrugged, a small movement that carried the weight of old grief. "After that, we decided maybe it was just going to be the 2 of us. And that was enough. More than enough." Samuel set down his coffee cup, not knowing what to do with his hands. The storm outside seemed louder now, or maybe the silence inside felt deeper. "He used to sing while he worked," Martha continued. "Old hymns mostly, but sometimes just nonsense songs he made up. Silly rhymes about the cows or the weather or how my biscuits were going to make him fat as a pig." She smiled then, just for a moment, and Samuel caught a glimpse of who she must have been before grief carved new lines around her eyes. Lord, he had a terrible voice. Couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. But he sang anyway, especially when he thought I couldn't hear him. Lightning lit up the windows, turning everything white for an instant before thunder shook the house. Martha jumped slightly, then laughed at herself. "Jeremiah always said storms were just the sky throwing a tantrum," she said. "Nothing to do but wait it out and clean up the mess after." The wind picked up, howling around the eaves and making the fire dance. Samuel watched Martha's face in the flickering light and realized she was not really talking to him at all. She was talking to the empty spaces where another voice should be, filling the silence with memories because silence had become too heavy to carry alone. "He was going to plant apple trees," she said. "Saved up for 2 years to buy good saplings from back east. Was going to put them in that flat spot behind the house. Make a little orchard for our old age. She gestured toward the window, though there was nothing to see but rain and darkness. Got sick before the trees came. I planted them myself after the funeral. But they never took root. Ground was too hard. Or maybe I didn't know how to do it right without him there to show me. Samuel wanted to say something about apple trees, about how sometimes they needed a season or two to get established, about how next spring might be different. But the words felt too small for what Martha was carrying, too simple for the complexity of loss. Some nights I still set 2 places at the table, Martha said. Just habit, you know? 20 years of setting 2 plates, 2 cups, 2 of everything. Hard to remember that one is enough now. She paused, and her voice got quieter. Hard to remember that one was ever enough before I knew what 2 felt like. The storm raged on through the night and into the next day. Samuel slept on the floor by the fireplace, wrapped in an old quilt that smelled like lavender and thyme. When he woke, Martha was already up, making breakfast like she had done every morning for 23 years, filling the house with the sound of normal life continuing despite everything. They ate in comfortable silence, listening to rain that had settled into a gentler rhythm. The worst of the storm had passed, but the sky remained gray and heavy with water still to fall. "Tell me about the cattle," Martha said over her second cup of coffee. "What condition are they in?" So Samuel told her about the thin cows and broken fences, about the work that needed doing and the time it would take. Martha listened like someone who understood that caring for land was not just about the land itself but about everything that depended on it staying strong. "Jeremiah always said this place could support 100 head easy, maybe more with the right management," she said. "Course, that was before he got too sick to keep up with the work." "It's good land," Samuel agreed. "Just needs attention." "Most things do," Martha said, and something in her voice made him look up from his coffee. She was watching him with an expression he could not quite read, like she was measuring him against some standard only she knew. The rain stopped that afternoon, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and new possibilities. Samuel stepped out onto the porch and breathed air that felt different somehow, lighter than it had before the storm. Martha came out behind him, and they stood together looking at puddles that reflected pieces of sky. "Ground's too wet to work today," she said. "Tomorrow, then." Martha nodded and went back inside, but not before Samuel caught something in her face that had not been there before. Not happiness exactly, but maybe the memory of what happiness felt like. Or the possibility that it might feel like something again someday. That evening, she made a pie from the last of her preserved peaches, and they ate it while the sun set through breaking clouds. Neither of them mentioned the storm or the long hours of words that had filled the house like rain filling empty vessels. But something had changed between them, subtle as the shift from winter to spring, fragile as the first green shoots that push through hard ground when the weather finally turns warm. Outside, the land stretched wet and clean toward tomorrow, and Samuel found himself wondering if some storms were meant not to destroy, but to wash away what no longer served, making space for whatever wanted to grow in the cleared ground. Spring came slow that year, like something afraid to show its face too soon. The apple trees behind the house stood bare and stubborn, their branches reaching toward a sky that could not seem to decide between winter's gray and the pale blue promise of warmer days. Martha checked them every morning, walking the same path through wet grass, looking for buds that refused to come. Samuel watched her from the kitchen window while he drank his coffee, understanding without being told that those trees carried more weight than wood and bark should have to bear. They were Jeremiah's last gift, his final act of faith in a future he would not live to see. And they were dying. "Got a letter yesterday," Martha said one morning, setting an envelope on the table between their breakfast plates. "From my sister in Tucson." Samuel nodded and waited. In the weeks since the storm, Martha had begun talking more, but she still rationed her words like someone who had learned that speaking too much could use up all the quiet you needed to think. "She wants me to come live with her. Says a woman alone has no business trying to keep a ranch running." Martha's fingers traced the edge of the envelope. "Says there's teaching work in town for someone with my education. Says I could start over, make a new life. What do you think?" Samuel asked. Martha looked out the window toward the struggling apple trees. I think starting over sounds easier than it is. I think 23 years of life doesn't pack up neat in a trunk and travel well on the stage to Arizona. Samuel buttered his biscuit and tried to imagine Martha in a town, teaching children their letters in a schoolhouse that had never known Jeremiah's laugh. The picture would not come clear in his mind. Course you could sell this place, Martha said, not looking at him. Land's worth good money to the right buyer. Take the cash and go back to wherever you came from. Probably make more in one sale than most cowboys see in 10 years of wages. The suggestion hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Samuel had thought about it, of course. Had lain awake nights in the barn calculating what the land might bring, what he could do with that kind of money. But every time he tried to picture himself riding away from this place, something in his chest pulled tight like a rope under strain. I could, he said finally. Probably should if I had any sense. But you won't. It was not a question. Martha was watching him now with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. No, Samuel said. I won't. They finished breakfast in silence, and afterward, Martha put on her old work dress and went out to check the cattle. Samuel found her an hour later standing in the middle of the herd, counting heads and making notes in a small book she carried in her apron pocket. We're down to 58, she said without looking up. Lost 2 more over the winter. That spotted cow with the lame leg and the old bull that was too proud to stay in shelter during the ice storm. Samuel nodded. He had found the bull himself, frozen stiff near the creek, and spent a morning digging a hole big enough to bury something that stubborn. Jeremiah always said this land could support more cattle if we managed the grazing right, Martha continued. Rotate them between the south pasture and the creek bottom. Give the grass time to come back strong. That would take fencing, Samuel said. And time. And 2 people working together instead of one trying to do it all alone. Martha closed her little book and looked at him directly. In the morning light, he could see gray threads in her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of nights spent worrying about things beyond her control. But there was something else there too, something that reminded him of green shoots pushing through hard ground. I've been thinking, she said, about my sister's letter, about you selling the land, about what happens next. Samuel waited. What if we tried something different? What if instead of running away from what's broken, we figured out how to fix it? The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 small decisions that would have to be made day after day, season after season. The decision to stay when leaving would be easier. The decision to build something together when both of them had reasons to trust that nothing built lasted forever. It wouldn't be easy, Samuel said. Nothing worth doing ever is. That afternoon, they walked the property together, Martha showing Samuel things Jeremiah had taught her about the land. The best places for winter shelter. The spring that never ran dry even in the driest summers. The old Indian trail that ran along the ridge where you could see for miles in every direction. He used to say this place chose us as much as we chose it, Martha said, standing on the ridge with wind moving through her hair. Said some land calls to certain people, and all you can do is answer or spend your whole life wondering what you missed. Samuel looked out over the valley spread below them, at cattle moving like slow brown clouds across green grass, at the house sitting square and solid in the afternoon light. He tried to imagine other people living here, strangers who would not know that Jeremiah had sung while he worked or that Martha had planted apple trees that refused to grow. What about the trees? He asked. Martha was quiet for a long moment. What about them? You said they never took root. That maybe you didn't plant them right. Maybe I didn't. Or maybe they just needed more time. Maybe they needed someone else to believe in them before they could believe in themselves. Martha looked at him with something that might have been surprise, or might have been the beginning of hope. That evening, they sat on the front porch and watched the sun set behind clouds that looked like they might hold rain. Martha had made fresh bread, and they shared it with butter and honey while the day cooled around them. If we do this, Martha said, if we try to make this work, it has to be clear between us what it is and what it isn't. Samuel nodded, understanding that some things needed to be spoken plain. I loved my husband, Martha continued. Loved him in a way that doesn't just end because he's gone. That love is part of who I am now, part of what I bring to this place. I won't pretend otherwise to make things easier. I wouldn't want you to, Samuel said. And you've been drifting for how long? Years? Decades? What makes you think you can settle down now? What makes you think you won't wake up one morning and want to saddle your horse and ride toward whatever horizon looks most promising? Samuel considered the question seriously, because Martha deserved that much honesty. I don't know, he said finally. I can't promise I won't ever want to leave. But I can promise that if I stay, it'll be because I chose to stay. Every day. Not because I'm trapped or because I don't have anywhere else to go, but because this is where I want to be. Martha nodded slowly. That's honest, at least. They sat in silence as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and was answered by another, their voices weaving together in the kind of conversation that needed no words. We'll start with the fencing, Martha said eventually. Get the pastures set up right for rotating the cattle. Then we'll see about getting more stock, improving the herd. And the apple trees? Martha smiled, the first real smile Samuel had seen from her since the day he arrived. We'll tend them too. See if they just needed someone to believe they could grow. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of light that made everything look possible. Samuel found Martha already up, making coffee and planning the day's work like she had been doing it for 23 years. But something was different now. The careful distance that had marked their first weeks together had settled into something more like partnership. They worked side by side that day, pulling old fence posts and measuring new lines for the pasture divisions. The work was hard and slow, but there was satisfaction in it, the kind of deep pleasure that comes from building something that will last longer than the people who built it. At noon, they rested in the shade of the barn and shared water from the same jar. Martha's hands were dirty from the work, and there was a smudge of soil on her cheek where she had pushed back her hair. She looked more alive than Samuel had ever seen her, like someone remembering what it felt like to have a future worth working toward. You know, she said, looking out over the land they were learning to call theirs, I think this might actually work. Samuel followed her gaze across fields that would soon be green with new grass, toward a house that was beginning to feel like home, and found himself believing that some things were worth the risk of staying, worth the chance that two people could build something good from the pieces of what had been broken. In the distance, thunder rumbled soft and promising, and the first drops of spring rain began to fall on ground that had been waiting all winter to remember how to grow. So that's the story for today. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. On a scale of 10 to 0, how would you rate this story? And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay happy and take care.